Hi everyone, I'm going to present our work towards user-centered climate services, the role of human-computer interaction. My name's Jake Rigby and my co-author is Preist. We're both from the University of Bristol, and this work was completed as part of the Down to Earth project, which is seeking to improve the provision of climate services across East Africa. What exactly are climate services then? A commonly used definition from the WMO is the provision of climate information in such a way as to assist decision making. And I'd just like to clarify a bit further. So climate information in this context is a very broad definition. Normally when we think of climate, we're thinking of long-term projections, but in this context it also incorporates very much shorter-term forecasts as well, what we might think of as weather, and also additional environmental information such as wind or hydrological information like what a water level is going to be like. So quite a broad definition. And there are many users of climate services throughout the world and many decisions that they have to make. So right from high-level scientific users who might work for government ministries or international organisations, right down to individual citizens, for example, farmers who might need to think how they should manage their planting for the coming season. And what exactly makes a climate service? What do they look like? So they normally start with national meteorological and hydrological services who are producing the scientific data through observation networks and modelling, for example. And this can incorporate additional institutions such as government organisations and universities, for example. They can also incorporate events. So in some parts of the world they have climate outlook forums, or even that could be a more community level type event. And there are also tools, bulletins and websites through which people interact with climate services. And these can be both technology based, so websites for example, but also not technology based, so a bulletin could be printed out. One big challenge in the climate services research area is that of user interaction. As services typically originate from climate scientists and the natural sciences, they're typically based on what can be supplied by them rather than what the users are demanding. So they're typically supply driven rather than demand driven, top down rather than bottom up. And one of the problems is that there is often a lack of expertise in interacting with users to really understand their needs in this area. This sounds like a perfect fit for HCI research. We have technology systems with a diverse range of interactions. We have many different groups of users with different capacities and different user needs. And we have a need for better user interaction expertise to really understand these users and design better systems for them. However, we actually found that there is very little crossover between HCI and climate services research. And we evidence this by performing a series of systematic literature searches. So you can look in the paper for the exact results. But in short, we found that only a handful of HCI papers really mentioned climate services. And we also found only a small amount of research outside of the HCI domain that used HCI methods in a climate services context. So the question is, why is there such little crossover? One of the reasons is that HCI researchers are simply not aware of this research area, and obviously if they're not aware, then they cannot conduct this research. Number two is that this research can be quite logistically challenging. So although climate services are used throughout the world, often the focus is on the global south and developing regions. And so doing this research in those locations to interact with users can be a lot more difficult than, say, conducting a lab study with students at a university. Number three, this research requires new collaborations. So to really make an impact and conduct this work, we need to be working with natural scientists and climate scientists, for example, and currently this doesn't seem to be happening. Number four, this research requires a long-tailed approach. HCI has often been criticised for having an often short-termist approach, so focusing on a new technology, doing a small study and then moving on to something else. Not all the time, of course, but sometimes. But in the climate services research, we need to be looking at a much longer timeline to really realise impact. Another question is, how can HCI actually contribute to this research area? Well, firstly, understanding users, their context and user needs. So this is something that HCI obviously really excels at. On this slide here, you can see we've got 3 different farmers. We've got one from Europe, one from Asia, one from Africa, each with very different needs, different context, different access to technology, different capacities. And so we would need to treat the technology for these very differently. Number 2 is the development of decision support tools. So these are the way in which people often interact with climate services to help them make decisions. So here's one example from our partners in East Africa. So obviously this is something that HCI excels at again, is developing software to really support people and fulfill user needs. Number 3 is data visualization and mapping. So as you saw on the previous slide, there is often a mapping element to climate services. Or at least a data visualization method, and we need to know what is the best and most effective method to convey data to different users. And obviously there's a long history of HCI research in the area of data visualization. Number 4 is understanding the type of work that happens around climate services and decision making. You can see in this picture, it's the situation room of our partners in East Africa who are a large climate service provider. And so there's collaboration happening here using software systems. So there's a CSCW angle to see, how do people come together and collaborate to make these decisions, but also at a more cognitive level, exactly what processes are people going through to make decisions. Number 5 is integrating scientific and indigenous knowledge. In different areas of the world, there are different knowledge systems and epistemologies that people rely on, use, and trust. And so we should be looking to see how we can integrate these different knowledge systems with the science and into new technologies to create systems that people trust and therefore will use. Number 6 is new paradigms for climate services delivery. Something that HCI excels at is having an imagination and looking to the future with new technologies. So on the one hand here we have new technologies and new interfaces for interacting with climate information and climate services. So on the other hand, we need new approaches for how to deliver climate services and technology to communities who might have differing notions of technology use and different norms surrounding it. And I'm speaking as a white European here, your mileage may vary. But for example, delivering to entire communities rather than to an individual as we might. Another question is, why should HCI contribute? Well, one reason is to respond to climate change. So this is a real concrete way in which HCI can respond to climate change and realise some improved climate adaptation. Number 2 is research with marginalised and underrepresented groups. So in recent years, there's been the Chi for Good ethos and, really wanting to make the HCI community more representative and perhaps give a voice to marginalised people. Number 3 is interdisciplinary research and collaboration. So there are fantastic opportunities here to work with new people and forge new research agendas. Number 4 is situating HCI at the forefront of an increasingly critical field. As I said before, the focus is often on the global south with climate services. However, as the effects of climate change are more keenly felt around the world, everybody is going to have to start interacting with these climate services more often. And it makes sense that HCI has a seat at this table to really ensure that the technology is fit for purpose and fulfills user needs. So in conclusion, we have a real need for for HCI expertise within the climate service research domain. And there are many areas which I've outlined in here, which you can read more about in the paper, where HCI can contribute and forge new research agendas. And this research can really play an important role in improving climate adaptation around the world. Thank you very much.